In the shadowed corridors of history, few figures evoke a sense of terror as visceral and enduring as Vlad the Impaler. Emerging from the tumultuous landscape of medieval Romania, Vlad's name has become synonymous with cruelty that transcended mere punishment to become an institution of fear. The stories that surround him are woven with acts of brutal punishment, most notably impalement, a method so ghastly that it has cemented his legacy in the annals of dark history. But what is it about Vlad's methods that continue to haunt our collective consciousness? To understand this, we must first step into the haunting world in which he ruled, a land riddled with chaos, invasion, and internal unrest. Imagine bleak, fog-laden mornings in Wallachia, a principality caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and its fiercely independent rulers. The landscape is dotted with medieval castles, their stone walls echoing with secrets and stories of violence. Ominous shadows stretch across the countryside, hinting at the horrors that unfolded within. It was during this volatile period that Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler, rose to power. Born around 1431, he was the son of Vlad Dracul, a ruler himself infamous for his own violent methods. Vlad's reign was marked not just by political intrigue, but by an unrelenting desire to establish authority through fear. His brutality was not random but calculated, a horrifying tool to instill discipline, deter rebellion, and protect his realm from external threats. It is important to recognize that much of what we know about Vlad's impalements comes from a mixture of historical record and legend. Foreign ambassadors, European travelers, and local chroniclers all documented tales of his cruelty, but their accounts sometimes conflict, some emphasizing the horror, others hinting at propaganda used to blacken his name. Archaeological findings, such as bones discovered near execution sites, lend weight to the stories, yet much remains shrouded in mystery. Were all these atrocities as widespread and brutal as legends suggest, or were they exaggerated in the stories told by enemies seeking to vilify him? This ambiguity fuels ongoing debates among historians and enthusiasts alike. Despite, or perhaps because of, his notoriety, Vlad's impalement methods served a deeper purpose. They were psychological weapons, designed not only to eliminate enemies, but to instill a pervasive atmosphere of terror among his subjects. Fear kept dissent in check and helped him consolidate power in a land riddled with internal rivalries and external threats. Over time, these dark deeds made him a figure both reviled and revered, an archetype of the ruthless ruler whose cruelty became the stuff of myth. Today, Vlad's brutal legacy persists, inspiring stories, films, and legends that continue to evoke a mixture of fascination and horror. In the end, Vlad the Impaler's grisly reputation endures precisely because it taps into a primal fear, the deathly scream of someone dying on iron spikes. His name has become emblematic of terror, a reminder of how brutality can forge legends that outlive the ages. As we journey through the dark history of his reign, we confront not only tales of death, but also reflections on the complex nature of justice, power, and human cruelty. In the early 15th century, the region known as Wallachia was a land shrouded in turmoil and constant upheaval. Nestled between the immense power of the Ottoman Empire to the south and the expanding Hungarian kingdom to the west, Wallachia was a strategic yet volatile principality. Its rugged mountains, dense forests, and fortified castles served as both natural defenses and symbols of its enduring struggle for sovereignty. The region's geopolitical position made it a focal point of frequent invasions, political chess games, and shifting allegiances that kept its rulers perpetually on edge. During this period, Wallachia was plagued by internal strife. Noble families vied for control, pledging allegiance to larger empires while also fiercely defending their own interests. The princes or voivodes often relied on cunning, alliances, and sometimes ruthless suppression to maintain their power. Ruling was a delicate balancing act, on one hand, resisting external domination, and on the other, dealing with internal rivalries that threatened to plunge the land into chaos. This turbulent environment created an atmosphere where violence and brutality often became tools for survival and dominance. The Ottoman Empire's expansion was a relentless threat, forcing Wallachian rulers into a precarious position. While some sought alliances with the Ottomans to secure their borders, others fiercely resisted their influence, viewing it as an existential threat to Wallachia's independence. Vlad the Impaler's father, Vlad Dracul, earned his name partly through his dealings with the Turks, accepting suzerainty in exchange for military support, though his successors, including Vlad the Impaler himself, would later reject Ottoman dominance entirely. This constant push and pull added layers of tension and violence, setting the stage for brutal conflicts and harsh punishments aimed at quelling dissent and asserting authority. Beyond external threats, Wallachia's internal political landscape was equally unstable. Nobles often rebelled, claiming the throne for themselves or orchestrating coups. These power struggles frequently ended in bloodshed, with impalement sometimes used not only as punishment but as a display of strength and deterrence. The land's populace suffered under this cycle of violence, often caught between warring factions and oppressive rulers. The fear of betrayal and treachery was omnipresent, and harsh punishments were wielded to instill fear and cement loyalty. Vlad's brutal reputation is born from these brutal realities. Economically, Wallachia relied on agriculture, trade, and its position along vital routes connecting the east and west. Yet, constant warfare disrupted stability and prosperity. The local economy struggled under the weight of sieges, occupation, and the costs of fortifying defenses. This economic hardship further fueled unrest, making the use of terror, such as impalement, an effective means to suppress rebellion and dissent. In sum, 15th century Wallachia was a land where survival depended on strength, ruthlessness, and political cunning. It was a place where violence was woven into the very fabric of everyday life. Governors wielded brutality as a sword and shield, and tales of impalements and executions became part of the enduring landscape of fear. This environment of chaos and conflict created the backdrop against which Vlad the Impaler would rise, his brutal methods shaped by the maelstrom of tumult that defined his homeland. Vlad III, commonly known as Vlad the Impaler, was born around 1431 in the mountain region of Wallachia, now part of modern-day Romania. He was the son of Vlad Dracul, a nobleman who earned his title after joining the Order of the Dragon, an elite military fraternity dedicated to defending Christendom against Ottoman encroachment. From a young age, Vlad was exposed to the brutal realities of medieval power struggles, and his early years were marked by political unrest, foreign invasions, and internal betrayals. These tumultuous circumstances shaped his outlook, molding him into a ruler who believed that ruthlessness was the only way to preserve his land and authority. Vlad's personality and reputation were fueled by his relentless drive for power and his penchant for brutal justice. His method of impalement, piercing victims through the body with iron stakes, was infamous throughout Europe and inspired terror among enemies. While some saw him as a tyrant and a monster, others in his homeland regarded him as a national hero who fiercely defended Wallachia from Ottoman domination. This duality persisted for centuries, creating a complex legacy rooted in both fear and respect. Vlad's enemies comprised a broad spectrum, each with their own dark pasts and motives. The Ottoman Empire, eager to expand into southeastern Europe, was one of his most formidable adversaries. The Turks viewed Vlad as a dangerous insurgent and propagandized his brutality to justify military conquest. But Vlad also faced opposition from within Wallachia itself, noble rival factions vying for control, often resorting to treachery, betrayal, and violence. These internal conflicts further entrenched a culture of brutality, in which death and suffering became tools to maintain dominance. The local population, caught in the crossfire of power struggles and distant wars, endured the consequences of Vlad's severity. While some accounts romanticize him as a defender of orthodoxy and local customs, others recount tales of villagers who met their end on iron spikes for minor offenses or perceived disloyalty. His enemies, both internal nobility and foreign foes, found themselves at the mercy of his impaling squads. The victims ranged from captured spies and traitors to diplomats and soldiers, many of whom were executed publicly to serve as a warning to all. Among the notable figures in Vlad's dark history were Ottoman envoys, whose dealings with him often ended in gruesome displays meant to demonstrate his defiance. Betrayals were commonplace, and plots against Vlad frequently resulted in swift and savage reprisals. His enforcers, often ruthless in their own right, understood that the terror inflicted on his enemies served a strategic purpose. Fear was a weapon more potent than any sword. And so, the landscape of his rule was lined with spikes, silent reminders of his merciless grip. In essence, the roots of Vlad's brutal legacy lie in a lifetime of brutal survival. His enemies were many, their stories intertwined with betrayal, ambition, and desperation. Vlad the Impaler's notorious method of execution, impalement, was designed not only to punish, but to serve as a gruesome spectacle of terror. Unlike quick or hidden forms of punishment, impalement was a slow and torturous process meant to instill fear in both enemies and the local populace. Victims were placed upright on iron spikes, which were typically sharpened at both ends. The executioner would often insert the spike into the victim's body through the anus, genitals, or lower back, causing immense pain and ongoing suffering as the spike traveled upward through the torso. The process was painstakingly slow. Historical accounts detail some particularly gruesome incidents. One famous anecdote recounts how Vlad impaled dozens of Ottoman officials and foreign diplomats who had been captured. These dignitaries were subjected to slow death on spikes, their agonized screams serving as a warning to other potential enemies. In some stories, Vlad's enemies were impaled alive, sometimes over several days, to ensure their suffering was prolonged. Families of enemies were sometimes forced to watch, heightening the psychological impact. Folklore and legends often romanticize or exaggerate the horror, but many historical chronicles confirm that impalement was an integral part of Vlad's brutal repertoire. The method served as a stark reminder that in a time of political chaos and constant threats, power often depended on pure terror. Vlad the Impaler's reputation for his brutal methods is built around a single, chilling image: enemies' dying screams echoing through the forests and towns of Wallachia. Impalement, his signature form of execution, was far from instant. It was a slow, torturous ordeal designed to maximize suffering and inspire terror among both the defeated and the watching populace. Chronicles from the period recount numerous victims, many impaled alive and left to die over hours or even days, their agonized screams piercing the night. These stories, whether entirely factual or embellished by legend, serve to illustrate the horrifying reality of Vlad's punishments. Victims ranged from captured enemies and traitors to foreign diplomats caught in the crossfire of his strategic wars. Some accounts describe enemies lined up in public squares, impaled and displayed as a grisly warning to anyone contemplating rebellion or betrayal. One notorious event involved the impalement of a band of Ottoman soldiers who had surrendered, only to be executed in front of their compatriots. As the enormous iron spikes pierced their bodies, desperate screams filled the air, a sound meant to strike fear into anyone who dared oppose Vlad's rule. Reports indicate that many of these victims were left on the spikes for days, their suffering prolonged to demonstrate Vlad's resolve and ruthlessness. The psychological impact of such executions cannot be overstated. For both allies and enemies, the sight and sound of dying screams served as an uncompromising message. Resistance was futile, and terror was the ultimate weapon. This fear effectively silenced dissent and subdued potential rebellions, consolidating Vlad's grip on power. The image of enemies writhing and screaming on iron spikes became a core part of his legend, a visceral reminder of what awaited those who dared oppose him. It was a form of psychological warfare, harnessing the horrors of death to quell opposition long before any military confrontation. Adding human depth to these stories are accounts of the executioners, men and women tasked with carrying out Vlad's commands. Some witnesses describe the conflicted feelings of those ordered to impale prisoners, caught between duty and horror. Others suggest that the terror of witnessing such deaths firsthand created a brutal atmosphere where compassion was scarce. These personal stories as to the horror, not just of death, but of the cruelty intertwined with political power. Over time, stories of these gruesome deaths became embedded in local folklore and international chronicles. Foreign ambassadors and travelers passing through Wallachia recorded their impressions, often emphasizing the terror and barbarity they witnessed. Archaeological evidence, though limited, has unearthed remains believed to belong to victims of impalement, alongside historical records describing palace terraces and battlegrounds strewn with spikes. These findings lend weight to the accounts of executions, though the true scale and brutality remain obscured by layers of legend and propaganda. Conflicting narratives also cloud the historical record. Some sources, especially those opposed to Vlad, portray him as a monster whose cruelty knew no bounds. Conversely, defenders argue that his methods, while brutal, were a desperate response to a chaotic and violent era, a reflection of the turbulent struggles for power. Modern forensic analysis continues to examine bones and remains, attempting to piece together the truth behind the tales. Throughout history, the gruesome tales of Vlad the Impaler's methods have been preserved not only through legend, but also via a variety of tangible sources, ranging from contemporary chronicles to archaeological discoveries. These evidence streams provide a layered perspective. Some corroborate the brutality described in stories, while others ignite debate over the accuracy or exaggeration of those accounts. One of the primary sources for understanding Vlad's notorious impalements comes from foreign ambassadors and travelers who documented their encounters in the 15th and 16th centuries. Turkish chronicles, often penned by Ottoman scribes, describe the impaling of enemies and prisoners as a hallmark of Vladimir's reign, emphasizing the horror and terror such punishments invoked. European travelers, like the Venetian ambassadors, provided vivid descriptions that, although sometimes exaggerated, painted a picture of a ruler whose cruelty was unmatched in his time. For example, some accounts speak of roads lined with thousands of bodies, impaled in a display of power and warning. While these stories contributed to Vlad's mythic reputation, they sometimes contained sensational elements that challenge verification. Beyond written records, archaeological findings have begun to shed more tangible light on these grim events. In regions around modern-day Romania, excavations have uncovered remains believed to be victims of impalement. Skeletal analysis from certain sites reveals trauma consistent with impalement injuries, a vertical shaft running through the pelvis or torso, suggesting a brutal execution method. Although direct DNA or other forensic evidence linking these bones to Vlad's victims remains elusive, these finds bolster the idea that such executions were not merely legend but part of brutal reality. Additionally, remnants of ancient iron spikes and spikes' bases have been discovered embedded in walls and the earth, matching descriptions of execution sites from chronicles. Interestingly, some documents suggest that not all victims suffered equally. Some were impaled alive in excruciating pain, while others may have been executed more swiftly. This raises questions about Vlad's motives, whether they were primarily terror tactics or if there were differences in the severity of punishment based on the circumstances. Modern forensic analysis has added depth to this historical puzzle. Forensic anthropologists have examined remains recovered from suspected execution sites. Analysis of bones sometimes reveals signs of trauma consistent with impalement, puncture wounds, the presence of iron fragments, or healed fractures from prior injuries. While definitive identification of victims as Vlad's enemies remains difficult, these findings confirm that impalement as an execution method was implemented in the region during that era. Occasionally, recovered artifacts such as rusted spikes or iron rakes further substantiate these accounts, giving material evidence to the stories told over centuries. However, these discoveries also highlight controversies and uncertainties. Some skeptics argue that the stories of mass impalements may be exaggerated or fabricated for political or propaganda purposes, especially by rival nations seeking to demonize Vlad. Conversely, others believe the archaeological record and chronicled evidence affirm that Vlad's terror tactics were as brutal as legend states. Discrepancies in descriptions, such as variations in the size of spikes and the number of victims, indicate that the true scale of impalement might be difficult to determine definitively. In sum, the evidence unearthed from chronicles, artifacts, and forensic investigations offers a complex tableau. It confirms that impalement was not just folklore but a documented and practiced method of punishment during Vlad's rule. Still, the full extent of these executions remains partly shrouded in mystery, bounded by the limitations of historical record and archaeology. The legacy of fear. How impalement shaped history and myth. Vlad the Impaler's brutal method of execution did more than simply eliminate his enemies. It left an indelible mark on history and myth that resonates to this day. The imagery of enemies dying screaming on iron spikes became a powerful symbol of terror and authority, influencing not only the perception of Vlad himself, but also shaping broader narratives of cruelty, justice, and tyranny in the medieval world. Historically, impalement served as a psychological weapon. Its slow, agonizing nature was designed to instill fear not just in those directly targeted, but also in the wider populace and rival factions. When enemies saw the gruesome display, victims impaled through the body, often over days, the message was clear: defy Vlad at your peril. Such acts of brutal retaliation suppressed dissent and discouraged rebellion, allowing Vlad to consolidate power in a tumultuous era characterized by internal strife and external threats. This method of execution also influenced diplomatic relations and foreign perceptions. Chronicles from Ottoman diplomats, European travelers, and other contemporaries vividly described the impaled victims and the atmosphere of terror. These accounts, often exaggerated or colored by propaganda, contributed to Vlad's reputation as a monster, a figure whose cruelty transcended ordinary notions of justice. Yet, some historians argue that stories of impalement were also magnified or mythologized to serve political agendas, painting Vlad as a quintessential villain to justify foreign intervention or internal rebellion. Beyond its immediate political effects, impalement became a legendary motif, blurring the lines between reality and myth. Over centuries, tales grew larger than life. Stories of impaled victims screaming in pain, of entire towns decorated with spikes, and of Vlad's unwavering cruelty. These stories fueled horror fiction and contributed to the archetype of the ruthless tyrant, an image that endures in literature, film, and popular culture. Bram Stoker, for example, drew upon tales of Vlad's cruelty when creating Dracula, embedding the myth of a bloodthirsty ruler who used fear as a tool of control. The stories surrounding Vlad's impalements also contributed to his complex legacy. To some, he remains a villain, an embodiment of tyranny and barbarity. To others, he is a folk hero who defended his homeland against Ottoman expansion, willing to undertake extreme measures to protect his people. This duality underscores the power of myth to shape reputation, making Vlad a symbol of both horror and resistance. Modern archaeology and forensic studies of remains purported to be victims of impalement have added a layer of scientific insight to these stories. Bones found with puncture marks and other signs of trauma provide tangible evidence that such executions occurred, though the scale and brutality described may sometimes be amplified in retellings. Nonetheless, these findings reinforce the presence of a terrifying justice system that employed terrifying means. In contemporary culture, Vlad's terrifying legacy endures as a symbol of the dark side of power. His brutal methods continue to inspire fictional villains and horror narratives, forever entwined with notions of absolute cruelty. Museums, documentaries, and horror stories capitalize on this reputation, keeping alive the legend of a ruler whose name is forever linked with screams on iron spikes. Ultimately, Vlad the Impaler's legacy demonstrates how acts of extreme violence can transcend time, shaping collective memory and myth alike. His use of impalement was not merely a tool of punishment, but a deliberate act of psychological warfare intended to dominate through fear. The story of Vlad the Impaler's reign is not merely a tale of brutality. It is a powerful reflection of how history, myth, and perception intertwine to shape our understanding of justice and tyranny. His reputation as a cruel ruler who used impalement as a primary method of punishment has left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness, inspiring stories that are often exaggerated, romanticized, or villainized depending on the perspective. At its core, Vlad's use of extreme violence served strategic purposes. In a time marked by chaos, invasion, and political instability, acts of terror became tools of psychological warfare. By making examples of his enemies, sometimes impaling them alive in public squares, Vlad sought to instill fear that would deter rebellion and maintain his authority. This approach raises complex questions about the nature of justice. Was he a tyrant enforcing brutal law, or a ruler employing harsh tactics that, while cruel, stabilized a fractured land? The answer is layered, as history often is, with shades of grey. His acts reflected the brutal realities of a turbulent era, but they also fueled legends that grew beyond the factual record, transforming him into a figure imbued with mythic terror. The stories of screams echoing on iron spikes have persisted for centuries because they tap into primal fears and serve as vivid symbols of absolute power wielded through violence. These legends have been further reinforced through art, literature, and Hollywood portrayals, which often forget or ignore nuanced historical context. The line between fact and fiction blurs. Some accounts may have been exaggerated by enemies eager to demonize him, while others might have romanticized his ruthless image as that of a dark hero fighting against Ottoman aggression. How society perceives these punishments speaks volumes about its values, what was deemed acceptable or necessary to maintain order. Today, such brutal methods are rightly condemned, but they also serve as historical lessons on the lengths rulers might go to consolidate power, and how cruelty can become embedded in the fabric of authority. Modern forensic investigations and archaeological findings have begun to shed more light on this dark chapter. Bones believed to belong to impaled victims have been uncovered, and analysis of historical records continues to reveal inconsistencies and conflicting narratives. Are all these stories entirely accurate, or are they amplified legends designed to serve particular political or cultural agendas? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, caught between the remnants of history and the stories that have been told to shape identities. As we examine the remnants and records, we see that Vlad's reign, like many historical figures, cannot be reduced to simple notions of good or evil, brutality or heroism. In the end, the shadow of Vlad's cruelty endures because it symbolizes more than just a ruler's methods. It questions our understanding of power, justice, and morality. His legacy asks us whether acts of extreme violence are justified in the face of chaos, or whether they ultimately tarnish the civilization that permits such acts to occur. These stories serve as stark reminders of the potential consequences when authority is wielded without compassion or restraint, reminders that echo through history, warning us of the thin line between order and tyranny. As we reflect on Vlad's reign, it's important to recognize that stories of horror and heroism are often two sides of the same coin. They probe the shadows of human nature, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about cruelty, justice, and the stories we choose to remember. Are these stories a testament to the depths of human depravity, or are they a necessary part of understanding a turbulent era, a reflection of the chaos that can arise when the rule of law breaks down? Ultimately, they remind us that history is rarely black and white, and that the legacies of figures like Vlad are complex, shadowed by the darkness of their deeds and the light of their myths.